Greetings all, Dr. Raphael X here with another video with a very special guest. But before anything else, let us start with the sign of the cross, remembering our baptism in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Receive
Mhm.
the blessings of our Lord. So please subscribe to this video, click on the like button, share this video, leave a message or comment, whatever you call them, all that good stuff. All right, so today we have a very special guest, friend of mine, Dr. Elizabeth Rex, who is a Catholic bioethicist who's an expert in the beginning of life bioethical issues. She has written a lot. She's a speaker. She has her PhD in philosophy from the University of Navarre, her MA from there too. She's working on her uh, theology doctorate from Pontifex University on bioethical issues, of course, the beginning of life issues. And she has founded and she's a president of the Donum Vitae Institute. She has also co-founded, and she's a president also of the Children First Foundation. So very active here in this field. And today we're going to talk about probably the most controversial pro-life issue within the pro-life movement. So this is kind of, we can say, within Catholic Orthodox bioethics. What do we do with embryo adoption? So of course, there's all these frozen embryos, right? This is a reality that we have to face. There's embryos that are frozen thanks to say it that way, to IVF, in vitro fertilization, which is basically the uniting, what they call vulgarly test tube babies, uniting the sperm and the egg outside of the womb, where people become the fruit of, they're not the fruit of the sexual union, they're artificially made, again vulgarly called test tube babies, and they have to make a whole bunch of a bunch of these embryos in order for the success rate, right? In order for it to be successful, basically. So Dr. Rex is going to talk about that controversy. They're frozen. A lot of these women have kind of these embryos frozen. And what's really interesting, as I read, is there's a case where someone was conceived in 1992. This was in the beginning, or when it really became popular, the IVF and the frozen embryos, 1992, and they were conceived in 1992 and frozen, and 10 years later they were born. I mean, the effects of this we do not know, right? So this is an evil that is done, but the question is, what do we do with these frozen embryos? Can we adopt them or no? Right? Can we adopt them or no? So I'm going to pass it to you, Dr. Rex. If you could just talk a little bit about yourself on what kind of what drove you to this issue? Why do you have a passion for this topic? And kind of if you talk in general terms of the controversy.
Thank you so much, Raphael. And I want to thank all of your viewers for tuning in. And I hope you'll like his program and like this program and send it to your family and friends. This is information, and I'm very grateful that Raphael has asked me to speak with all of you today. Um, there are about 1.5 million, but it could be more. It could be even 5 million or more frozen embryos in the United States today, right now.
Wow.
And I have been following this because it was very personal for me and my husband. We got married late in life. We were both 40, and we were looking forward to having a family, even though it was late in the game. And we couldn't. We discovered that, after 4 years, we had problems. So it was probably age, but we had to go to the doctor and have ourselves checked out. And I had fibroids, and we had to get rid of the fibroids. I had surgery, and we were timing things and doing all the natural family planning, and it wasn't happening. We just couldn't conceive. So we had heard, this is 1990, okay? So this is a while ago. We've been married now for 34 years.
Oh, wow.
And we, back then, there was no embryo adoption until 1999. The first baby that was ever adopted as a frozen embryo was, now she's 25 years old. Her name is Hannah Strigi. And of course, no one, she hadn't been born. She wasn't born until December of 1998. So, but we heard about IVF, and as a Catholic, my husband was Protestant, but we would never do IVF because we knew that was artificial fertilization, artificial procreation. It's three things. People don't know it's not just IVF. It's IVF is artificial fertilization. There's artificial insemination, and there is surrogacy, which is impregnating another woman who's not the wife. So the Catholic Church condemns artificial, those three things: fertilization, insemination, and surrogacy. Embryo adoption was not even known. And this was before Dignitas Personae, which was the first time prenatal adoption was even mentioned. That was in 2008. So this was unknown. But what we did do is, because I was older, they said we can do hyperovulation. So you can increase the number of eggs that are produced so that there would be a greater possibility of fertilization naturally. So we tried that, and it didn't work. In fact, we tried it twice, and I produced more eggs, but none of them were fertilized or implanted. So we had our cry, and we started looking into adoption. Okay, so and then we started breeding birds, cockatiel birds. We were living in New York. My husband worked at Lincoln Center. He's a concert violinist with the New York Philharmonic. Now he's retired. So we were breeding birds, and I got pregnant naturally. So here we were looking into adoption, forgetting about everything, time of the month, you name it. We just, and started looking into adoption. And all of a sudden, I I said, I got a pregnancy test and I was pregnant at age 44. And we couldn't believe it. But I was working at Columbia University, and our doctor said, you go home. This is your one chance. You stay home, you stay in bed, don't you do anything. And so we were blessed. Our son was born when I was 45. I gave hope to a lot of people who were married late in life or facing infertility. And we looked at each other and we said, wow, adoption really works. Let's try that again. So we started looking into adoption again. And this time we adopted our son, our middle son. And it was, you have to, in looking into adoption, it's a crazy world. Every state has different adoption laws. Those of you who might be interested in who are having trouble with infertility, the church has always praised adoption. It's a work of mercy. These children you can look into siblings where you want to keep two or three children that have been removed from a bad family situation and they can't get back because, their adoption laws are very strict. It's for the welfare of the children. They don't want children abused or killed. A lot of children are killed in their biological families. It's crazy out there. And so they're not married, they have boyfriends, there's crazy drugs and who knows what else is going on, and the kids get neglected and they get abused, and the state has the obligation to go in and protect them, try to sort out the family situation, see if they can go back to the family. But if they can't, then parental rights are terminated and you can adopt these children that are in foster care, right? So there's domestic adoptions. Newborn adoptions are virtually impossible. Most of the unwanted babies are aborted. There's only about less than 2% of all crisis pregnancies are the birth mother chooses life and chooses the loving choice of adoption. Very rare. It can take 2 to 10 years to adopt a newborn, while a baby is aborted every 20 seconds. this is the tragedy that leads some people to go to IVF because there are no newborns and they might not want to adopt kids from foster care that have been abused and have problems. It's just, but that's a work of mercy to welcome the stranger, to shelter the homeless, to feed and, you know, clothe the naked and the hungry. I mean, Christian morals and tradition have always praised adoption, widows and orphans, right? Especially if they're orphans. So, anyway, that's how my husband and I started the Children First Foundation because we realized after we adopted our son and later our daughter, when we were both 50, we were helping pregnancy centers. We were raising money. My husband was a concert violinist. We did little recitals and we would donate two, three, $4,000 to a pregnancy center to help women choose life and consider adoption as a loving choice. And really, birth mothers and birth fathers, the ones who go through pregnancy and choose a family to adopt their son or daughter, are heroes. What a loving choice that is. They give the gift of life to their son or daughter, and they give that gift to another couple like us. What a gift. They are so loving. It's so courageous. It's an amazing. So my husband came up with the name that birth parents put their children first, their lives and their welfare. They want their son or daughter to have a loving family that can give them what they cannot. Sometimes it's adultery, they're married to someone else, they're poor, they can't support themselves, there are problems. They just know the right decision is they can't raise them, and they want them to be raised by a family that they can choose. They can actually know, and because there are like 40 couples wanting to adopt every newborn that might be available for adoption. So they can choose whoever they want.
That's right. That's right.
So it's a very loving choice. So we became very proactive raising money for pregnancy centers and as advocates of adoption, because unfortunately, the pro-life movement doesn't do a great job promoting adoption, and we should. And there's even an anonymous adoption. Maybe some of your viewers have um, heard about the safe haven laws, because many times women would hide their pregnancies. They didn't want to have an abortion. They didn't want anybody to know they were pregnant, because many times women are threatened, abused, and even killed if they don't have an abortion. So babies would be found abandoned in churches or in dumpsters or in toilets. And it just finally, around the year 2000, safe haven laws began to be passed. Tim Jacquard and the Children of Hope Safe Haven program. It's bring the baby to a hospital. Give birth. You can even give birth in a hospital. No questions asked, no ID, no medical information, just give birth. It's legal to then relinquish the baby if it's unharmed at a fire station or a hospital, and the baby will be immediately adopted. There's a long list of people who would love to adopt a newborn. And the woman, just anonymous, walks out of the hospital. But if they abandon the baby or if the baby is killed, they will find the birth mother and she will be imprisoned for up to 15 years or more for child endangerment. So women, we need to promote adoption. So that's how I got started. And then in my own journey with my husband, we have two adopted children. And actually my daughter, we adopted. It was a Russian couple that walked into a pregnancy center. They didn't speak English and they thought they were walking into Planned Parenthood. It was in the Bronx. The pregnancy center was in the same building. And Chris Slattery and Expectant Mother Care was able to tell them, no, we're here to help you. Do you want to keep the baby? And they were dirt poor. They could barely support themselves. And he said, well, we can help you place the baby for adoption. And they weren't sure about that. They would want to choose the family, but we were raising money for Chris Lattery, and he used that as an example for the people who were there as to the kind of work he does to help women choose life and consider adoption. So the same thing, um, she was born exactly 10 days after Hannah Streaky, who was the world's first adopted embryo. She was born on December 31st, 1998. My daughter was born January 9th, 1999, just about 10 days later. So they're the same age, they're 25. And what is so amazing is we knew nothing about embryo adoption. We would have probably looked into that ourselves, but we didn't know it even existed. So um, there is a there are two documents in the Catholic Church. Um, one is called Donum Vitae, and it was during the pontificate of John Paul II. And the other one is Dignitas Personae during the pontificate of Benedict XVI in 2008. So the very first test tube baby was actually born just 3 months, the very first in the whole world. Louise Brown, she was in England. She was born in England. It made news around the world. I mean, test tube baby, because infertility has always been a big problem for so many people, right? Back to biblical times. So um, she was born in 1978 in July. And then Paul VI died. We had John Paul I only for 1 month, and then he passed away. And then it was 3 months after Louise Brown was born that John Paul II was elected Pope. And thank God, because he was such an amazing moral theologian. But from 1978, which is when Louise Brown was born, the big controversy, Raphael, as you know, was birth control,
Oh yeah.
artificial contraception, preventing procreation, right? People didn't want to have babies and they were using artificial contraception. And the church condemned that in 1968, Humanae Vitae. So 10 years after the big controversy about birth control, which was very controversial, people thought birth control would be absolutely fine. It would prohibit, abortions. It would be this wonderful discovery. And the church said, no, cannot separate the unitive and the procreative from the marital act within marriage. It's not what God intends. So he has a built-in system. You can have responsible parenthood using natural family planning, but not artificial contraception. So that was 68. And then just 10 years, can you believe it's exactly the same date, July 25th, 1978, 10 years to the day that Louise Brown was born.
Oh
I was
wow.
like, amazing coincidence, providence. But now this is artificial procreation, not artificial contraception. So now we have
Right.
artificial fertilization. It's like the two sides of the same coin that we cannot separate the unitive from the procreative. This time they're separating the conjugal act from conceiving a baby in vitro, in IVF. So, but it took John Paul, because he was still dealing with artificial birth control, the pill, and he had written the theology of the body. We've probably all heard. Pope had already written a book called The Theology of the Body in Polish. He was about to publish it, but instead, for many years, he gave a weekly audience on the theology of the body, which explains why the unitive and the procreative must always be united at every marital act. It should not be artificially prevented, or it should not be artificially removed from procreation. So there, so that took a while. So from 1978, when he was elected, to 1987 is almost another 10 years. So during those 10 years, from the birth of Louise Brown and the pontificate of John Paul to his actual Donum Vitae, a lot of IVF babies were born because it went crazy. And so, unfortunately, at the beginning, there was no cryopreservation. But then, about 1984, they were experimenting on all these embryos that in vitro, they were creating more embryos than could be implanted. And they started to see if they could be frozen. And they discovered that they could freeze them, but um, about 50% would die during the freezing and the thawing. It's brutal. You have to remove water. It's like freeze drying, and you add antifreeze so that the little cells don't crystallize and kill the baby. I mean, you adults, it's illegal to freeze yourselves. You have to have a death certificate because it will kill you. That's why you don't freeze a human being. And Nazis, scientists, doctors were experimenting during World War II. You know, how long could somebody survive in freezing water? Well, they did it till they died. And the world condemned all of these horrendous, heinous crimes against humanity that were committed in the name of science, you know, to save lives. You know, they were killing human beings without their informed consent. And that's where the Nuremberg trials and the Nuremberg Code came into existence in 1945. The world said never again. And so then with the freezing of these embryos, and the parents would not transfer all of them, they started to stockpile, build up. And so anyway, I got interested when I heard about it was in the National Catholic Register, a Catholic newspaper, very faithful. And Italy, back in 2004, I think that's when the first time I heard about this. So my daughter was born in 1999. This is like 5 years later. And they were talking about prohibiting cryopreservation. They were banning cryopreservation in Italy back in 2004. That's 20 years ago. And they did it. They actually got a law passed in Italy that said you could only, they wanted to regulate IVF because it was totally unregulated in Italy, which is a Catholic country. I was in Italy actually for 3 years doing my doctorate in Thomistic ethics. And it was very interesting. I saw how the government began, I was actually there when they legalized divorce. They said, not everyone is Catholic. This is a Catholic doctrine, so we have to legalize it. You know, Catholics don't do it if they don't want to, but we can't impose our religion on other people, right? So divorce is, they start with divorce. That was back in should I tell you? It might have been 1972 when I went there. It's a long time ago. But the next year, they came back for abortion. Oh, well, the abortion, that's a Catholic doctrine. Not everybody's a Catholic, ergo, they legalized abortion. Okay. Now, that was a long time ago. But with this IVF, the Pope had already issued his Donum Vitae instruction condemning IVF as artificial fertilization, artificial insemination, cannot move eggs and sperm in a petri dish, or having a doctor inseminating his wife with his own sperm artificially, or somebody else's sperm, or somebody else's egg and somebody else's sperm in a surrogate womb. All of those things were condemned in 1987 by John Paul II and the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, which at that time was Cardinal Ratzinger,
Mhm.
who is became Pope Benedict XVI. So he and those two together really took on the challenge of artificial procreation, IVF, surrogacy, and insemination. But of course, just like birth control, a lot of Catholics just said, I'm going to do it anyway. I don't want a baby, or I want a baby. And I don't care what the church and what God is telling me about what I should or shouldn't be doing. I want what I want. And it's very sad, but a lot of people were doing IVF. And finally, Italy, you know who did it first? Germany. Germany, after World War II and the Nazi atrocities, learned their lesson. And back in 1990, that was 3 years after Donum Vitae in 1987, and there were a lot of Catholics in Germany, and they had learned their lesson. Don't experiment on human beings, even if they're embryos. They passed a law in 1990 called the Embryo Protection Act.
Mm.
And they basically said you cannot harm or kill an embryo in Germany. Abortion was legal, but that's inside a woman's body. So these little embryos are not inside a woman's body. They didn't totally ban IVF, but they regulated it. They said you could only fertilize 3 eggs, up to 3 eggs, one or two, preferably just one or two, no testing, and transfer all of them into the woman's womb. So no freezing. And then there's no leftover embryos, or there's no leftover frozen embryos. And they banned scientific experimentation. You cannot create an embryo for scientific research. They banned all of that because it's the right thing to do, no matter the age or the stage of development. So this is why that was 1990. Now, Italy, you see, IVF is now happening everywhere. Virtually all the developed countries of the world were doing it. And in Italy, it was there were a lot of frozen embryos being left over. And so they had a conservative president, and they put together a law. It's called the Medically Assisted Reproduction Act, or law. It's also known as Law 40. And they didn't ban IVF, but they again regulated it like Germany did. And they said you could only, husband and wife, with proof that they're infertile. They've tried medical and they have proof from doctors that they are suffering from infertility. They could only fertilize up to 3 embryos, transfer all of them, no testing, no freezing, because in order to test them, then you have to freeze them because the results don't come back. And those little embryos grow rapidly. It's only 1 week from fertilization to implantation. So they allowed that. Married couples could only do it once. And if it doesn't work, they couldn't come back. If they had triplets or twins, there was no pregnancy reduction, as it's called. Oh, I only wanted one baby. Well, you got 2 or 3. So no abortion. So these were laws and regulations that got bipartisan support. They made sense to people. Don't harm or kill embryos that are created using IVF. And so then that was 2004. It made the newspapers. And it especially made the newspapers because the IVF industry, which is a $1 billion industry, went berserk. And they wanted to overturn the law in Italy. Okay. The Catholic Church was not in favor of that law. They're not in favor of IVF, but of course, it was so strictly regulated that basically it shut down the IVF industry. And no frozen embryos. You can't pay the fertility clinics to keep them frozen because the ones that were frozen, the couples had to decide, are we going to transfer those children or we don't want them? And if they didn't want them anymore, then they couldn't kill them. they had to send their frozen embryos to a single site in Italy, in Milan. And I need to do a little more research to see how many are still there. But basically, no more frozen embryos in Italy. No new ones were allowed. So all of this, when they tried to have a referendum, and then I'll let you ask some questions, the bishops and the Pope, the referendum was going to overturn the strict law, the moral, medically assisted reproductive law. They wanted to get rid of it and just make it the Wild West, no limits to IVF anymore, turn the clock back. And the Pope and the bishops in Italy said, no, this law is much better than the way it was before. No embryos are being harmed or killed after they've been conceived. Now, it was sinful to conceive them, but it's also sinful to conceive a child in rape or in adultery or incest or in fornication. Those are and in vitro or insemination, artificial insemination. You should not conceive a child that way. But the child is innocent, and the only choice is life. And you either decide to parent that child or place the child for adoption. Those are the two moral options. So the Pope and the Italian bishops from the pulpit were telling people to stay home, don't vote, because they had to have 50% of the voters plus one to have a successful rejection of the law, overturn the law. And so they failed. People stayed home, they didn't vote, and the law survived. And so what is very significant and is not well known is that Pope Benedict and the Italian bishops, it wasn't a candidate, it was an issue. It was a moral issue. And they told Catholics, posters, and it was in the newspaper. So National Catholic Register was picking up on all of this controversy in Italy and putting it on the front page where I saw it. And then I thought, whoa, I've never heard of these embryos and all of these things. And then embryo adoption started from 2004. 2005 was the referendum. 2008 was Dignitas Personae, just 3 years later. So people were already, I think, well, yeah, Hannah was born in 1998. So she was the first adopted frozen embryo. So now embryo adoption is starting up. And it's been very slow. There's only about a total of 3,000 children who are alive today. Hannah is 25 years old. She's the oldest. But 3,000 that were adopted, legally adopted as frozen embryos. So parental rights are terminated. The couples with the frozen embryos are the ones who initiate. Yeah, I'd like my embryos to be adopted. And then they match them with couples who want to adopt. And there was a pregnancy, an adoption agency in California, Christian Nightlight Adoption Agency, and they also call themselves snowflakes because they're little snowflakes.
Mm-hmm.
And each one is unique and distinct and is a little child, frozen. And the Striegis are actually good friends of mine. The mother, the father, Marlene, John, and
Oh,
Hannah.
wow. Wow.
I've been in touch with them for many years now, and we're working to help people understand that this is not artificial procreation. Procreation has taken place.
It's taking place. Yeah.
And now these children, if the parents don't want them for whatever reason, then they can be legally adopted. And then I'm the mother of my two adopted children by law. I'm the only mother they have because parental rights are terminated from the biological parents and they are transferred to the adopting parents. My name and my husband's name are on the birth certificates of my children.
Mm.
So that's what adoption does. Legally, you are the legal parent with the rights and responsibilities And it's for the protection of the child so that there's not two sets of parents fighting over this child. Everyone has to agree, and it's in the court, and it's legal and official. And so it's a different kind of act, which is merciful. It's a work of mercy to adopt children that, for whatever reasons, have lost their family or have been abused by their family and need a new forever family. And adoption has been praised by the church forever and into the Old Testament forever. And so there's a lot of still controversy because it is mentioned in Dignitas Personae. Could it be possible? Benedict and the congregation actually say there are hundreds of thousands of orphans. The Pope calls them orphans. Their parents don't come back for them. In fact, all trace of their parents has been lost. For all of those millions, there are hundreds of thousands that are truly orphans. Their parents have just abandoned them, and they don't even know where the parents are anymore. So the Pope calls them orphans. Back in 2008, which was long before this Alabama Supreme Court, which perhaps some of you and your listeners know, called these frozen embryos outside of the womb unborn children,
Yes.
extrauterine children, which, because of course they are. Jesus was an embryo. Holy Mary was an embryo. Joseph was an embryo. You and I were embryos. That's how life begins. And at that moment, we believe Mary was ensouled at the first moment of her conception.
That's right.
So we put it all together. That little embryo is Mary, and she's perfect.
Yeah. I like how
And
you mentioned before, when we were talking before, how theology elucidates is bioethics. I think we had this
there you
conversation
go.
before, how the Immaculate Conception. I mean,
Yeah.
she is the Immaculate Conception. That was she is essentially at that very moment she is immaculate, which means she's a person, which is a very illuminative there. That's fascinating. You did answer a lot of the questions though that I already had. But with the Donum Vitae, I mean the Dignitas Persona, um, which was written in 2008 by the Congregation Doctrine of Faith under Benedict the 16th. I did have a professor, so I did take bioethics. It was from Regina Apostolorum in Rome, and I teach bioethics. That's not my specialty, but and maybe you want to comment to this. I don't know if this is true, but he was of the opinion that Benedict the 16th leaned towards more of seeing that you cannot morally um he was tending a little more towards that. Obviously, this is not church teaching, but that you can't morally. So the question is, can you inject a because the conception's done, right? We have a person. Can you inject embryo that's not yours into um a mother that's not the a womb that's not the biological mother of the person. Now we agree that obviously the ideal situation is that an embryo reunites back to its biological mother, right, somehow. But is it some say it's a continue participation in the intrinsic evil. So the intrinsic evil is the sperm and the egg united outside the womb. That's done. But is there some type of participation in that intrinsic evil by going through even though the conception is done, you're going through the artificial insemination. So you have the artificial procreation done, that's done. But the artificial insemination is not done yet, and that's what you're going through. But then you also have on Dignitas Personae, which is interesting. It says um, proposals. No, I think it says right here that it's right here. Yeah. So it says it's praiseworthy. So Dignitas Personas called the proposal, right? Embryo adoption. Praiseworthy with regard to the intention of respecting and defending human life. But it presents various problems. So I don't know if you want to address some of those problems. You want to kind of because we were talking before also how kind of like the National Catholic Bioethics Center, the NCBC, has really taken a position. Um, And I don't know if they argued for it philosophically or they have taken it like in a more in a firm, almost dogmatic sense that this is the way it is. They have taken the position that you can't do it. If I understood you correctly when we were talking before, that they already have it as morally illicit. You cannot go through embryo adoption. You cannot adopt an embryo. But so some of those concerns, if you want to address them, I know one of the concern is that it's the slippery slope argument, or some call it a fallacy, which it can be a fallacy, but that it can allow, which is already condemned by the church, artificial insemination. That maybe wouldn't artificial, I'm sorry, not artificial insemination, artificial wombs. Wouldn't artificial wombs, it would seem, at least philosophically argued, wouldn't that be um, a better, because you're not really participate, you're not kind of trumping the natural process. You're thawing the embryo that's frozen, and then you're allowing it to live, but you're through an artificial process, but not an artificial process that would trump the natural procreative process. So if you want to address some of the concerns, if you want to mention some of the concerns on the other side, again, those who say that it's morally illicit, you cannot adopt embryos. And then if you want to address the concerns and rebut them.
Well, I want to thank you because this is how people should debate these issues. And there have been, as we know, even the Immaculate Conception was debated for 600 years.
That's right.
And Thomas Aquinas was saying, no, she was conceived in sin, and then she was instantly sanctified at the second instant of conception, but she was conceived in sin like everybody else. And Duns Scotus said, no, she's sanctified the first instant, not, and she was preserved from original sin, both in body and in soul, by a special privilege.
If I could just chime in, a Dominican told me that St. Thomas Aquinas, thanks to his denial, allowed for Scotus or an ulterior theology to elaborate on the preserving nature of her redemption, because
Yeah,
she had to be redeemed. She had to be within the
had been
universal
redeemed.
redemption of
Yep.
Christ. So,
That's why theology is just so fascinating. And even the personhood debate stems from the Trinity. How could there be three persons in one nature? And they finally resolved that after centuries of debate. And then along comes Christ, and it's one person and two natures. And how do we put that together? And that was another
right.
few centuries with the Arians and the Nestorians condemning each other. And so I would like to say that when Dignitas Persona came out, and it didn't come out on September 8th. If anyone does their homework, and I recommend that all of you go to the Vatican website and read or both Donum Vitae and Dignitas Personae. They're not that long, but I have studied them extensively, in depth. What does the Magisterium say? I'm a big believer in the Holy Spirit. Let's listen to the church. And they, when it came out, not on September 8th, and it wasn't on December 8th, which they thought would also be the day. And it came out on December 12th. But the UNOCCB already had a statement because they already had the document. Okay. It was delayed for whatever reasons. There was an election that year. I don't know why it was delayed, but it was. Usually documents by the church come out on the day that's on the document, but it was delayed for October, November, December. It was delayed for 3 months, but everyone had it. So the Vatican, when it promulgated Dignitas Personae, made an official statement that day. And it was in the Catholic News Agency. It was Monsignor Reno Fisichella, and he was the head of the Pontifical Academy for Life. He was the official voice of the Vatican when it was released. Said there are problems, but the document, Dignitas Personae, does not prohibit the practice of prenatal adoption. That was the big issue. They
Hmm.
were waiting for the church to come out on that issue. And the USCCB has an official statement and it's still on their website. And they echoed that very statement. There are problems, but the church has not prohibited the practice, not even just the debate, but even the practice. So that means Catholics in good faith, it has not been prohibited. It's okay to do it. The church, it, and the question was asked, could it be possible to adopt these frozen embryos? And we have to be very careful. Now, so there's freedom, and there at the National Catholic Bioethics Centers, there are ethicists on both sides of this issue.
Mm-hmm.
So, and they're very prominent and they're well known, but they should be saying it's in my personal opinion, not as an official statement of NCBC's position. Since the church is neutral, we're neutral, but we're arguing either pro or con, just like the Immaculate Conception between Thomas Aquinas and Duns Scotus. And Duns Scotus won that debate with the dogma. That was settled forever. It was at the first instant. It was fitting. God could do it, therefore he did. And we have to remember that's why we have the magisterium founded by Christ and who sent the Holy Spirit to guide us on these difficult issues. But we need to listen to the church. So Dignitas Personae is not dogma, but I want to read to you that it's in Dignitas Personae 19. And it's very important that we not alter the magisterium. So when Dignitas Personae says that embryos could not be put at the disposal of infertile couples as a treatment for infertility, and I could get into that. There are treatments that use IVF embryos. You may have heard of the 3-parent embryos. They actually destroy an embryo in order to put a nucleus of one embryo into the mitochondria of the other embryo that's destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
You cannot use embryos or do IVF in order to treat an embryo for genetic diseases like cystic fibrosis. There are couples who miscarry because of aneuploidy. It's an extra chromosome, and it causes the baby to miscarry later on in pregnancy. Maybe they did IVF, but now they want to do IVF in order to cure the embryo and then transfer the embryo. But you can't do that. You can't use embryos or do IVF to cure infertility, okay? So, but it goes on to say it is not ethically acceptable for the same reasons which make artificial heterologous procreation illicit. Now, heterologous means you're using a donor egg or a donor sperm, okay? It's not your wife's egg or it's not your husband's sperm. So you could say, well, the embryo is not the husband and wife's embryo, it's heterologous. So there's some confusion between using heterologous gametes, donor sperm, donor eggs for fertilization. Okay, so now that embryo has been conceived with IVF and it's heterologous fertilization. It violates marriage. It's not the husband's sperm or it's not the wife's egg. It's somebody else's sperm, somebody else's egg. That's what violates marriage. And it can even be both. To do IVF, artificial procreation, which is fertilization and insemination. So insemination is inseminating sperm into the wife at the right time of month to cause a pregnancy, a conception. And the church condemns that, especially if it's not the husband and wife's gametes, as they're called. But then it goes on and it says, it heterologous procreation, donor gametes, illicit, as well as any form of surrogate motherhood. using another woman's uterus, and that surrogate is hired to gestate the baby on the condition that she then turn the baby over when it's born to the people who made the contract with her. That's not embryo adoption either. Okay, so there's clear differences here. We got to understand what's what are the definitions? And then it goes on. This practice would also lead to other problems of a medical, psychological, and legal nature. It does not mention moral or ethical
Mm.
problems. Okay, so every word matters because I have read articles where they say medical, psychological, legal, and ethical nature,
Mm.
or medical, psychological, legal, and moral nature, problems of a moral nature. In fact, one of the great defenders of embryo rescue or embryo adoption, he's now passed away, was Dr. William May of the Catholic University of America, one of the greatest moral theologians, very close to John Paul
I think
II.
he has a, did he write the
He has a
I
book on
use
moral
his moral
theology.
theology for yeah, my in my college class,
Yeah.
the purple book.
Yeah. I taught his book called Catholic Bioethics and the Gift of Human Life. And
Yeah.
there's his
Excellent.
moral theology book. Yep, that
Yeah,
one.
it's excellent.
So he was saying we're not dealing with fertilization, artificial fertilization. The baby has already been fertilized, conceived. It exists. Now it's an embryo. Now it's a child.
Right.
Now it has rights, the right to life, the right to be carried in a womb. It should not be deprived of a mother's womb. It has a right to implantation. It has a right to gestation for 9 months. The right to life includes all of that and birth. And nothing should stop that right to life. If you stop embryo transfer, it's actually called embryo transfer, not insemination. Insemination is with
Mm.
semen, with
Right.
sperm.
Right.
So
Right.
embryo transfer, it's sometimes called IVF and embryo transfer. But if you only do IVF and no embryo transfer, you got a problem. You're you're depriving that embryo of the right to be in its mother's womb. And most people, when they do IVF, they want that baby moved to the womb. And that's what should happen. And in most cases, it does, unless you have surplus embryos. You're not going to move 8 embryos into the mother's womb.
That's right. That's right.
So,
Yes. All right.
so it actually, Dignitas Personae, you can see my book is just all filled with underlining and highlighting and stickies and everything. It says that those embryos should never be cryopreserved, but of course they do it to save the life, but that's the end does not justify the means. Cryopreservation is intrinsically condemned, is illicit, illegal, immorally reprehensible, unacceptable. You never should freeze an embryo, but that means you shouldn't fertilize more eggs than you can transfer. And that can be done. But because the freezing actually here in 18, where it talks about freezing embryos, why is it wrong? Well, it harms and can kill the embryo. That's the major reason. But it says it deprives them at least temporarily. Even if it's just temporarily, it's wrong. It deprives them at least temporarily of maternal reception and gestation. You cannot deprive that child that's been conceived immorally. And
Right.
now it's frozen. It says, don't do that. Don't deprive the embryo of maternal reception and gestation.
Right.
That falls under the sin of abortion. That's what abortion does. It prohibits implantation, or if it has implanted, it prohibits gestation. The
Right.
child has a right to life and it has a right to maternal, and it's in the Donum Vitae says the same thing. And then there's a Latin version, and it has three different translations in English. It says you cannot deprive an embryo of maternal, this one says um, reception. One of the other ones says maternal shelter and gestation. And the third one is maternal care and gestation. That's where the embryo belongs. That's why embryo transfer to the womb is necessary. In fact, I would like to read to you that Donum Vitae specifically asks, it's a separate heading, and it says, are therapeutic procedures on embryos licit? Can you cure an embryo with
Mm.
medical therapeutic procedures, medical interventions? And it says, yes, since the embryo must be treated as a person, it must also be defended in its integrity, tended and cared for to the extent possible in the same way as any other human being as far as medical assistance is concerned. That's Dignitas Donum Vitae 1:1, right at the beginning of the document.
Right.
And it's cited in the Catechism of the Catholic Church 2274. I hope you and your audience will remember the Catechism of the Catholic Church 2274 and 2275. Now
I'll
I'm
put
going to
the
read.
links also to Donum Vitae and Dignitas Personae in the section down there, the description. If
Well,
I could
these are
chime in here, what would you say to someone who asked, do we have to be proactive in wouldn't these be considered extraordinary means or an extraordinary ways to keep these people alive? As opposed to like would the parents of these frozen embryos would they be allowed to if they did not want to give them up for adoption, would they be allowed to, and I think Dignitas persona or I forget which document addresses this, can the biological parents freely choose to thaw their frozen unborn children and kind of just let them pass away without using some extraordinary, because some people say, well, this is extraordinary. We're just kind of, since the evil is done, they don't want their children. Let's say they repented and they just say, well, I know this is kind of, some people say, well, we don't want to do something extraordinary. We just kind of want to unfreeze them and just because they're probably, and we don't even know the effects they're if they're going to survive. We don't know what potential, genetic effects that their them being frozen would have. So could we just be kind of passive in this and just say, well, we did the evil, we repent of it, and we just let it go?
no. And it's because it's in again, I hope maybe you could post this on your website for
I
people.
will.
I've put together what to do with frozen embryos because parents are perplexed. They have frozen embryos. They don't know what to do. They're suffering. But what does the church say? What does the magisterium say? Does it say anything? And believe it or not, if you read it carefully, it's all there. So, for example, it says, um, I asked the question, may parents freely choose to thaw and let their
Mhm.
frozen unborn children die naturally, quote unquote? No. It says parents, quote, may not freely dispose of the physical integrity or life of the unborn child. And that's Donum Vitae 1:4. So you can't just let them die, especially when you could transfer them to your womb. They are your children who need to be in the mother's womb for gestation and birth. And so 2275 to me has the most important clarification that needs to be understood, because I think this is where a lot of confusion between some of the ethicists who are opposed to embryo adoption. They say, well, you can't do something evil for a good intention, right? Which, of course,
Hmm.
that's absolute moral theology, ethics, period. You can't do
But one,
something evil for a good intention.
that's right.
Well, likewise, you can't freeze them to preserve their life because freezing them is intrinsically evil. You have to transfer them into a mother's womb for gestation. They have a right to life. That's a right that is inviolable. And they are children who must be treated like any other patient. And so 2275 in the Catechism cites Donum Vitae 1:3. And it's go to the Catechism, you'll see it's citing Donum Vitae. It says, as with all, is are medical and therapeutic procedures carried out on the human embryo illicit? That was the question. And it says, as with all medical interventions on patients, and the embryo is a patient, it's a child now. It's been conceived immorally, but it's outside of the mother's womb, and you can heal it and save it. So it says, one must uphold, and it's in italics, it's been emphasized in the original. One must uphold as licit procedures carried out on the human embryo which respect the life and the integrity of the embryo and do not involve disproportionate risks for it, but are directed towards its healing, the improvement of its condition of health, or its individual survival. So any medical intervention, any therapeutic procedure to heal and save the life of an IVF embryo that's frozen or fresh in the petri dish must be considered licit to heal and save its life, just like any other patient. So here it doesn't say embryo transfer, but you can't do any medical intervention without embryo transfer. And the way you transfer the embryo is very simple. They use a little tube in which the embryo is carefully placed, and that little tube is inserted into the mother's womb, and that embryo is pushed into the mother's womb at the right time of the month, so it has a chance at implantation. And then it's up to God. The doctor cannot implant an embryo. It's
Right.
up to that little embryo itself to be able to implant and God. So you've done what you can do. Even with natural intercourse, the babies are fertilized, children don't implant. A lot of them don't implant for whatever reasons. Maybe there's a genetic defect. Maybe it isn't the right time of the womb is not quite right, whatever it is, but we leave that up to God.
Right.
And the husband and the wife are doing all they can to give that child, their child, a chance to implant and to grow and to be born.
Let me
So,
no,
yeah,
no, I was just going to ask you if the embryo adoption is seen as a lesser of two evils, or is it seen as an act of, let's say, radical hospitality? Because I don't know if you've heard of, because the bishops actually, when the year following the Dignitas Personae, they kind of stressed on, I think it was a USCCB, they stressed on the serious moral concerns, and they actually wrote in this letter.
not moral concerns.
That's interesting because in this article I'm
Yeah.
looking at, it says serious moral concerns. I don't know, in quotes.
The document
It does
Dignitas
not say
personae
serious moral concerns, does
doesn't
it?
say moral concerns. In fact,
Interesting. Hmm.
um, there is a Donum Vitae 1.5. You have to read
You're
Donum
right.
Vitae in order to
It does
understand
not say that.
Dignitas Personae. You can't just look at Dignitas Personae. You have to go back because they build on
Mm,
Donum Vitae. They accept
interesting.
everything in Donum Vitae and then they answer additional bioethical questions. And Donum
Because
Vitae says, should human embryos obtained in vitro be exposed to death? And it says, no, it is, quote, not in conformity with the moral law deliberately to expose to death human embryos obtained in vitro. Dignitas 1.5. So the moral law tradition, the Catholic moral tradition says you may not deliberately expose to death an IVF embryo.
right, right.
This is
So
the
it
Catholic
would be
moral
morally
tradition.
illicit the other way around, of course. Yeah, that is clear. I
So
think
you
that
cannot kill it.
can be
You
quiet too.
cannot freeze it.
Hmm.
You cannot give it to scientific research because that'll destroy it. And artificial wombs are condemned in Dignitas Personae.
I think
Even
that
the
the
hypothesis of
USCCB,
an artificial womb, they say no artificial wombs. It's a machine. No animal wombs. People have said, well,
right.
can you put the embryo on a sheep or a pig? It says nothing, no animal uteri, no artificial wombs, not even the hypothesis of an artificial uterus. And I don't know why people are not reading and quoting the magisterium.
Yeah,
Well, what about
I think what they're seeing when it says various problems, at least according to this article, quoting this is from the Catholic Register, quoting the USCCB. So it's in quotes. So apparently, and it could, and you're right, it does not say, going back to Dignitas Personae, it does not say moral problems, but they interpret it as. So this is what they say. They
yes?
say the serious moral concerns, it is quoting from their letter, particularly as it requires the wife in the adopting couple to receive into her womb an embryonic child who was not conceived through her bodily union with her husband. So they're interpreting it as and then as a moral concern, and then they go on to say the church's teaching authority has acknowledged the moral concerns associated with this practice. The terrible plight of abandoned frozen embryos underscores the need for our society to end practices such as IVS that regularly produce so many spare or unwanted human beings. Okay, they're just kind of talking about the issue, but there's all to build on that. I don't know if you know Dr. Kevin Donovan. I don't know if ever he works at Georgetown University Medical School and he's
I haven't, I'm
a
not familiar with
bioethicist there, and he's a director or the former director of the Pellegrino Center, and they work for clinical bioethics and they do stuff like that. But he told the Register that the frozen embryos uh, is a dilemma that so he's talking about the dilemma is that a wrong has occurred in bringing them to life, and it would require another moral wrong to put them in a situation where their life could be continued safely.
it.
But he's saying, in light of this, you have to say which is the greater wrong here, to leave them perpetually frozen or to proceed with implantation, which itself is not the proper way of procreation.
What is wrong is to keep them frozen.
It would seem, yeah, it would seem.
That is a intrinsically evil that not even temporarily, it's condemned by the Catholic Church. We have to go by the magisterium. I don't know who wrote this article. I don't know where it was published. You have to
It's in Catholic
dig deep.
Register. It was written last year by Loretta Brown, who's she's a
Well, we have to see where she's getting her information because it's not in Donum Vitae and it's not in Dignitas Personae. So a lot of people come up with a lot of their own personal feelings and conclusions. But I think what we need to do is make sure we are faithful to the magisterium that has the Catholic Church. What does the Catholic Church teach? So
Right.
what is immoral is to keep them frozen. And it's a second evil to abandon them
Right.
forever. So sometimes they say, well, I'm going to come back. I've got two, I'll come back for two or three more. But what if you have 20? Like Hannah was one of 20 embryos that were adopted, legally adopted. So that means when you adopt, because I'm an adoptive mother, and I've been told, oh, adoption is just legal fiction. You're not the real mother. I'm sorry. People don't understand that parental rights are terminated and they are established in law. And there's only one mother, and it's the adoptive mother. And that's your kid now. You can't give him back. You can't change your mind. Now you are the responsible parent, mother and father. And if you adopt embryos, see, it's never happened before. This is like those embryos that were frozen in 1992, they were frozen for 30 years.
Mm.
They were adopted 2 years ago by a family that already had four children of their own. And they were Christians who said, we want to adopt these children that have been frozen for 30 years. And they adopted three, and two of them were able to implant a little boy and a little girl, Lydia and Timothy Ridgway. And they were on the front cover of the New York Post, and I have it framed in my office here because those 1.5 million, many of them are dead after so many years. They die of decay and freezer burn and the freezing and the thawing. But many of them are still alive. They'll be born when they're 40 years frozen, 50 years frozen. They're
Right.
sitting there
They're sitting, yeah. No, there's something
and
has
they're
to be done.
orphans.
I mean, they're orphans, and I mean that's. But what do you think about the position? There's another ethicist who's pretty famous. I don't know if you heard of Kent Lasnowski.
Kent Lesnowski.
Yes, he
Yes,
said that he actually agrees that embryo adoption is a type of, a radical hospitality, right? That could be potentially done in lines of teaching in the church, but he doesn't see a tacit approval. That's kind of the way you're seeing it. He doesn't see, because what he's saying is that because there's a lack of clarity on the issue, it's a safer moral position for Catholic couples to refrain from actually participating in embryo adoption, since it's still debated in theological circles. So because we don't have an answer to it, he's saying it would be safer to not do, to just kind of wait. What do you say to that?
I actually wrote on that very topic in 2011. That's a few years ago. And William May was the first one who I listened to, and he brought out what the Vatican officially stated
Hmm.
and what the USCCB officially stated the day that Dignitas Personae was promulgated. And both of them, the Vatican and the USCCB, specifically stated, and you can find it, it's in the newspapers, it's on the website of the USCCB, Dignitas Personae did not prohibit the practice, not the debate. And then, oh, well, you can debate the issue, but you just can't do it. No, it said they did not prohibit the practice of embryo adoption, prenatal adoption. So anyone who he or she is free to contradict the Vatican and contradict the USCCB is free to do so. But I'd rather be faithful and tell people with a clear conscience, this is what the Catholic Church has said. It does not prohibit the practice. You are free to do it. It has not been prohibited. And anyone who says the church has prohibited is contradicting the church and is contradicting the USCCB. It's that clear.
Right, right.
It's very strong. And people have very strong feelings because they want to be faithful Catholics. But we have to listen to the magisterium. We have to listen to the church. And it's all in there. So basically, I know we've been talking now for a while. What the church condemns is artificial fertilization. It does not prohibit artificial implantation. Now, call it artificial implantation. Doctors call it therapeutic procedure to save its life. That's not artificial, that's medical intervention to heal and save a child's life. It must be transferred into the womb of its mother
Right.
or a mother, a maternal womb. And in the case of embryo adoption, that's not donation, it's not surrogacy where they're going to hand it over to someone else. That's my child that I have adopted. I am the child's mother, and I am bringing that abused and abandoned and frozen child into my womb, where, God willing, it will implant and grow and be born and baptized and live a Christian
Yeah.
life.
That's another issue
And
with the baptizing the embryos. I mean, tremendous. This is a problem. I mean, just going through the gestation so that they can be children of God through baptism. I mean, that's a strong argument for the position of embryo adoption to be able to get baptized because of these
you
embryos
cannot,
installing and letting them die. I mean, there are people that are dying without baptism, which is, I mean, this is really bad. What do you say though? This might last kind of playing the devil's advocate about obviously we have to get rid of freezing embryos. That's intrinsically evil. That's bad. But what about is creating a culture of saying, well, they can be rescued by through embryonic adoption. Like just that mentality, kind of, if that becomes prevalent, that kind of allows a culture, a mentality to not really care so much, not be accountable for freezing embryos. Oh, this embryo will probably be adopted anyway. You know what you understand what I'm saying? It's kind of creating this
yes.
mentality of, oh, this embryo is going to end up dead. Like it's in the back of the mind of those doing the IVF that I'll probably be adopted anyway. We're doing a good work.
Well, let me say, it's very sad that an unwanted pregnancy is usually aborted. People don't choose adoption. Many people would rather abort the baby than to let the baby be adopted. That's just a very sad commentary on our culture of death. How would you kill your child rather than let it be adopted? In fact, the wisdom of Solomon, those two mothers that were fighting over the baby, and Solomon said, well, let's just cut the baby in half, kill it. And the true mothers said, let the other woman have it. And then he knew who the real mother was. The one who said, I'd rather let it be alive than dead. And then Solomon knew who the real mother was. That's what we have to promote. So it's giving the gift of life. And quite frankly, the more embryos that are adopted and are born, I'm hoping I can get Hannah Strigi to talk with the Pope to help settle this issue. You may not have heard that the Pope, a few months ago, wrote a preface to a book. The book, he encouraged somebody to write it even, was called The Miracle of Life. And the Pope, in his preface to this book, it's not an encyclical, it's not a magisterial document. He said, listen to the embryo. That's amazing.
Hmm.
What he or she has to say about themselves. What are the threats that are endangering their lives? And I am hoping that Hannah and many others, there's a wonderful family. So Hannah was one of 20. She was 19 of her siblings didn't make it, but she's given names to every single one of her siblings
Wow.
that died. And she actually wrote an amicus brief to the Supreme Court in the Dobbs decision saying, I am living proof that viability begins at conception. I was alive. Here's a picture. She has a picture of herself as an embryo. She's one of 3 embryos that were thawed and then transferred, and she was the only one that managed to implant. But she said, I was alive while I was frozen for 2 years. She was frozen for 2 years, and here I am. And I'm very glad I was adopted, that I'm not in some cryo storage tank, concentration cans, as Blessed Jerome Lejeune called them, like concentration camps, concentration cans, where thousands of embryos are frozen in a single container. And this other family has 4 daughters. They were all fertilized at the same time and frozen, because many times there's 10, 15 or more frozen embryos that are left over from a family that already has 2, 3, 4, 5 children already from IVF, and they just can't think about, 10 more. But most of them don't survive. They don't implant, but they could have a family of 6, 7, 8, 9, or 10. There are families
Right.
that are blessing, large families. But 2 of the daughters that were adopted and born were frozen for 5 years. Then they did another transfer from the same group, and they had been frozen for 7 years. So these 4 beautiful sisters now have a country band, and they sing country music, gospel
Oh,
songs.
wow.
They even have Christmas carols. I think their newest album. And I'm hoping that we can take this family to sing to the Pope. Let him talk with them. Let him listen to them. They are children just like all of us who were conceived, regardless of how we were conceived. We have a right to life. And if for any reason a husband and a wife family cannot, sometimes the mother dies, she gets sick, she gets old. I know a family called me from Canada, and the wife was having C-sections, and they they had 11 embryos left over. And Canada only allows 1 embryo at a time to be transferred. I mean, she doesn't have 11, 12, 13 years left to have a baby every year, but they want their children. But I say, well, think about adoption. You can choose the family. You can choose the Catholic family of your choice. You can have an open adoption. They can raise the children. They're children by adoption, but we're all adopted children of God. We're all God's family. It's Parents are only temporary, really.
That's
We
right.
are here to help them be born and baptized. And in heaven, there won't even be marriage. We're all
Right.
God's children, daughters and sons of God, divine filiation. So I really think, based on my research, that the magisterium is opposed to artificial procreation, which is fertilization, insemination, and surrogacy. That's evil. But once the child has been conceived, it is immoral to deprive it of maternal shelter and gestation. It says that. And therapeutic procedures to heal it and to save its life, medical interventions. You have to use tubes and doctor to place the baby where it belongs, in the mother's womb. That is
Right.
moral. In fact, it says it must be considered licit. It doesn't say could be, might be. It's not even a lesser evil.
Right.
It is absolutely mandated. And if you don't, there's actually in Dignitas Personae number 23, Raphael, I hope you'll look it up. It calls new forms of interception and contragestation that fall under the sin of abortion. So, for example, it's just not a surgical abortion anymore. We have the chemical abortion, right? That's a technical means. It's a pharmaceutical, it's a chemical that kills the baby, prevents it from implanting. It's actually a form of interception. It prevents implantation. Anything that prevents implantation is an interception. It's an abortion by a technical means that by whatever means, an abortion is the deliberate, procured termination or prevention of implantation. And cryopreservation, I believe, falls under that category. Freezing prevents implantation and gestation.
Right,
And if it falls under the sin of abortion, that is late sententia. Canonical law means it's automatic excommunication.
right,
You cannot kill an unborn child by any means. And this is a technology. Freezing is a technology. Pharmaceuticals, birth control, you know, the morning after pill, emergency contraception has been condemned by the Catholic Church because it might kill an embryo. Well, freezing definitely kills embryos. And if you just leave them there, it's going to kill every embryo. And
that's
you
right.
cannot recommend a chemical abortion. You cannot recommend freezing. I don't know why some ethicists are recommending keeping your children frozen. That's preventing them implantation. This is very serious
Yeah.
stuff.
And
And
I
then there's
think,
contragestation, which is like the IUD that will dislodge an
oh yeah,
implanted embryo, right?
yeah,
So
that's
that's another form of abortion using a technical means, and it talks about technical means. So you cannot use freezing. So I'm saying what the church condemns is artificial procreation, fertilization, insemination, surrogacy, and freezing, because that kills and harms embryos. And if they're left there, that's an abortion. They are going to die. It's a death sentence, a
I
freezer burn.
I think you
Okay.
have hit it right on the nail because that's how I was going to end this video, which there is no third position and there is no third option, which is perfectly, you hit it on the head. It's really to not decide is to decide for death, ultimately, is
Yes.
what you're saying, because it's really you're either for life or you're for death. And really waiting is promoting the death of, because the longer you wait, frozen, obviously, that's not good. You're not promoting his life, is gestation. And even if you think, which it is, it's a more imperfect way, maybe even uncertain way in a sense that how it's supposed to, how the gestation goes. I'm saying without it's not the non-biological mother. It's definitely it's a greater failure of charity not to act. I mean, it's a tremendous. I mean, even if you have an imperfect way of allowing, right, this person to actually go through the process of life, you have to choose that over death. So even the argument of saying that, okay, this is not the best option, but I mean, okay, sometimes you have to choose between um, options that aren't optimal. We can say, obviously, the optimal option, as we mentioned before, is to um, transfer the embryo into the natural mother. But that's not, if you have many frozen embryos, the natural mother doesn't want to. The next best option within charity would be this embryo adoption. And I think I think it's clear. I think it's pretty clear. I'm not sure why the church hasn't spoke on it. Um, I think we should do another video on this, hopefully in the near future.
I would
Um,
love to do that.
and maybe with more details because there's a lot we can talk to, and you have a lot of background information, which I think is necessary to kind of pinpoint the issue, to get the issue down. But we will end it at this because we're well over an hour and a half. But thank you so much for coming on,
Thank you,
Elizabeth.
Raphael.
And yeah, until next time, God bless you guys all. And until next time, I'll give you the last word though, Elizabeth, if you want to say something.
Well, I would just encourage those who do have frozen embryos and who are suffering with that we need a new ministry for post-abortive parents. We have Project Rachel. We might want to have a Project Hannah for post-IVF um, couples or individuals because they are suffering. And we need to reach out to them and say, there is a good option. Either bring them home and you increase your family, or choose adoption. It's a loving choice. And we're all adopted children of God. And so I hope as more children are adopted from frozen embryos, we will increase the culture of life. We need, as pro-life Catholics, to value life and help each other. There are difficult circumstances, but we need to promote parenting and adoption because there are difficult circumstances, and adoption is a good choice. It's a praiseworthy for the intention and in itself. It's all of the works of mercy rolled into one. So it is what we do to the least of our brethren. Do we, how do we care for them or not? And it's actually the Good Samaritan. Remember, our Lord praised the Good Samaritan. It's actually in Donum Vitae and Dignitas Personae. And Jesus said, go and do likewise. You pick up the injured and you bring it in, you take it home basically to a tavern, heal it, save its life. While the priest and the Levite walked on by, Jesus praised the Good Samaritan and said, do go and do likewise. So even though it's a stranger, homeless, it is a child in need of a loving family. And I think that, I hope, is where the church will land. And especially if I can get some of these children to the Pope and he can listen to them,
Very
I
powerful.
think he will see
That'd
they
be
are
very powerful.
like
Yeah,
Jesus and Mary, like all of us, children of God.
indeed, indeed. Well, amen. All right. Well, thanks again for coming on. God bless you, and God bless you all.